All I wanted to say was that I'm Nick Chown. I'm not a proper academic myself. I mean, the most I've ever done is 2 days a week for a university, and that in the last 2 years. And I'm only a few months away from achieving 70 years of age, so I can't really class myself as an academic, but I do have a fair few publications to my name. I have written a book on autism theory, and I co-edited a book on neurodiversity. So they're my favourite subjects. Hopefully in a moment I'm going to be able to talk to the autism worldview dilemma. But what I'm going to say next is that Paul Davies quoted Damian Milton. I wrote it down from the slide, and I think he said what one considers autism to be will impact best practice with autistic people, and that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about. I describe that as the autism worldview dilemma. Hopefully the slides will appear and I can expand on that.
Are you seeing those? Let me see.
They're just on the screen now. If you do this,
right, and I'll then go back into slide view. How's that? Can you see them, Nick, as well?
No, I can just see AM. I can just see your initials, Allison.
Okay.
Currently on your title slide.
You can see the title slide, Damian.
If Nick pulls up the PowerPoint on his own screen, then I can then.
Oh, there we are. It's appeared.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. Yep. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much. These slides have a pale yellow background, and I'm told that that is suitable for dyslexics. So I hope everybody can read this. I've already mentioned that Paul had quoted Damian Milton. What one considers autism to be will impact best practice with autistic people. That's essentially what the autism worldview dilemma is about. Can we change the slide, please? Okay. Anybody who can remember the program, the event program, will see that I said philosophical perspectives on autism. I actually meant to say theoretical perspectives, so just blame that on old age. You know, what is actually behind this presentation, what's driving it, is applied behaviour analysis. I know it's not in the title, but that is what has prompted this presentation, concerns with ABA. I'm going to be talking about ABA training delivered by a major US organisation delivering ABA training, some repetitive behaviours, and I'm also going to be talking about driving around a roundabout. You may wonder how that can relate to ABA. I mean, hopefully that will become clearer in a moment. The autism worldview dilemma is my way of describing the situation with ABA. At the end of this presentation, in fact, most of this is pretty practical stuff, but the end is going to be very practical. And I'm going to be talking about the role of research in overcoming the autism worldview dilemma. If we can change the slide, please. People who know me know that I have a particular interest in theory, but most people don't. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about theoretical perspectives on autism. The point I want to make with this slide is that there are a considerable number of different perspectives on autism. There are 8 of them captured here. I may not have captured them all. There are probably others. I've tried to put them in a spectrum. At the top, you've got not fully moral human being. I mean, there are people who think that we completely lack empathy. You know, complete nonsense, of course, but there are people who think this. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got some people who say that there is actually no such thing as autism as we all know it. And there are a whole host of different positionalities in between those two extremes, and some are medical model based, some are a social model based, and neurodiversity comes into it, of course, with the penultimate item, natural human difference. So that's all I want to say about theory. The point is that after 80 years since autism was first named, and obviously it existed, well, it's probably always existed, 80 years since autism was named, and we still do not have a definitive perspective on what autism is, and that gives rise to what I call the autism worldview dilemma. Now let's get stuck into talking about applied behaviour analysis. Can we change the slide, please, Allison? What I've done here is to identify some. There are all sorts of other publications that I could have referred to. I've chosen one I consider to be some really key ones. This is Pookie or Pucky, I don't know how they pronounce themselves, et al., very recent this year. And they're saying that the overall quality of evidence of the effectiveness of ABA is low or very low. A very large percentage of ABA research involves conflicts of interest. So a lot of ABA research is undertaken by proponents of ABA. Well, of course, that's fair comment. You would expect that to be the case. It isn't always as objective as one might hope it would be. And then a really important one here, a recent US Department of Defense report has shown that a lot of autistic people, mostly children and adolescents, have expressed serious concerns about the lack of results from their ABA provision. Okay, so they're saying here that ABA may not be as effective as the proponents of ABA seem to think that it is. But can we move on? Next slide. This is, I think, the very first piece of work by an autistic researcher showing that it's not just a question of ABA not necessarily always working in an ABA context, but that it can actually cause harm, trauma, PTSD, and so on. Now, this is Kupferstein's report from 2018. She's a sole researcher, did all the work by herself, unfunded, doing the work in her own time. Nevertheless, it was good enough to be published in Advances in Autism, and I think the findings are pretty clear, and this is something rather that people need to listen to. She says, individuals exposed to ABA had a 46% likelihood of indicating post-traumatic stress symptoms. That's nearly half, nearly 1 in every 2 autistic people exposed to ABA developed PTSS. Now, that's pretty concerning, isn't it? Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, please. This is by Leaf et al., also 2018. It's a response to Kupferstein's report. Now, Justin Leaf is the leading light of an organisation called, I think I can get this right, Autism. I can't remember it exactly. I should. Oh, it's on the slide, isn't it? Autism Partnership Foundation. Now, as their name suggests, they are solely focused on autism, and their focus is on developing ABA and applying it to autistic individuals. Now, they criticised Kupferstein's report. They said that her results should be viewed with extreme caution due to several methodological and conceptual flaws. Well, I've already said that methodologically, maybe there were a few weaknesses, but if you're working on your own, that's almost inevitably going to be the case. I think for me, it was a sound report, and the conclusions were equally sound. I would point out that all 4 authors of Leaf et al. Are part of the Executive Council of the Autism Specialist Interest Group, which is an associate organisation of the Association for Behavioural Analysis International, and they're publishing under that affiliation. And indeed, the commentary was funded by the Autism Special Interest Group. So here we have somebody rather clearly with a conflict, a group of people clearly with a conflict of interest and being funded to respond to unfunded autistic research. So let me move on, please, to the next one. Yep, thank you very much. Well, of course, I've got to mention myself, haven't I, at least once. I hope you'll forgive me for doing that. I pointed out here, as I've just said, Kupferstein's study was undertaken by a single unfunded independent researcher in her own time. Given the restrictions she will undoubtedly have faced, her work is of high quality and should not be dismissed despite the methodological weaknesses. And I concluded, well, my colleague and I concluded that unless and until there is clear scientific evidence against Kupferstein's preliminary finding of a link between ABA and PTSD, we think she and this finding should be taken seriously. Now, I should add to this that there has been further publications about this by supporters of ABA, and I can't see that my colleague and the paper here, Chown et al. 2019, has been referred to. I mean, it may have been. I may have missed it, but I don't think it's been acknowledged. So can we move on to the next slide, please? This is McGill and Robinson, 2021, another very recent piece of research investigating long-term impacts autistic adults have experienced from childhood participation in ABA. And if you look at the final bullet, it says there in the third sub-theme referred to by McGill and Robinson, people were left with feelings of self-rejection and a sense of self-loathing as a consequence of their experience of ABA. So, first of all, we're thinking of maybe ABA doesn't work quite as well as proponents of ABA seem to think that it does in relation to autism. Then we came on to the possibility of a PTSD in relation to ABA. And now here we're talking about feelings of self-rejection and self-loathing. Now, these are important conclusions that have been drawn, and I'd like now to go on to the next slide, and I'm really sorry about this, well, I'm quoting myself again. Leaf and another set of his colleagues, I think this was a slightly different study from the one that I've just reported to, discussed the concept of social validity. This is, I think, really, really important. They say it has long been a hallmark of ABA, and I've read a lot of stuff about ABA, and I would entirely agree with them. It is. And it's something other that dates back to a piece of work in 1978 by a bloke called Montrose Wolfe. And he set out what he considered to be the 3 elements of social validity. And I just want to highlight the first one, the social significance of the goals. And he said, the highlighting in bold is mine, are the specific behavioural goals really what society wants? Now, my colleague Murphy and myself, we don't like this issue of hitting on people because the way they are is not what society wants. And we refer back to, and it's actually not all that long ago that gay people were regarded as disordered in many societies. Actually, anybody who's interested in the football going on in Qatar at the moment, well, I'm believe that gay people are regarded as disordered in Qatar. Now, homosexuality was included in the two diagnostic manuals, and it was only removed from the second edition of the DSM in 1973, and that's okay, sort of 50 years ago. But you know, in reality, 50 years is not a great length of time. Now, this is an indication that 50 years ago, homosexuality was not what society wants. So gay people were pathologized. They were included in these diagnostic manuals. So there is a real danger, Shona Murphy and I feel, in applying any intervention, whether it be ABA or anything else, on the basis of what society wants. So can we move on to the next slide, please? This is another really interesting piece of work. Again, it's very new. It's 2022. It's about so-called restricted and repetitive behaviours. And they say, arguably, the ethics of conducting interventions for stimming behaviours, which Paul Davies also referred to in his presentation, remain controversial, questioning whether the perception of the observer, not the individual with the behaviour, is the issue. It seems to me that there are an awful lot of people who just simply do not like autistic people stimming. They just don't like it. So, well, let's eradicate these behaviours. Okay. Now, one of the items in my theoretical slide that I'm just going to briefly mention now is ABA. It's underpinned by a philosophy, a theory called radical behaviorism. Under radical behaviorism, people are essentially just a set of behaviors. So I think I'm right in saying that when ABA proponents talk about recovering people from autism, all they actually mean is that they've eradicated, to the best of their ability, or eradicated as far as they can, what they regard as unacceptable autistic behaviours, essentially, aka stimming. Now, I would argue, and I think probably everybody listening to me now would argue, that that's actually harmful. You've eradicated the behaviours, you haven't eradicated the autism. You can't, you know, you're born autistic, you die autistic, and you're autistic in between. So let's go on to the next slide. And I want to talk about repetitive behaviours. And the first thing I want to talk about is ABA training. Now, in order to understand ABA better, I undertook a 40-hour, I mean it, 40 hours. It was dreadful. It really was dreadful. It was, I mean, at various points, it was really upsetting and made me exceedingly sad to see what was going on. But I took this 40-hour training in order to better understand ABA. Now, in that training session or sessions, I'm doing it over quite a lengthy period, there was absolutely nothing about autism. It was 100% content in relation to ABA-based techniques. They said nothing about autism as we would understand it, nothing about cognition, sensory sensitivities, anxiety, Luke Bearden's global stability concept, anything like that. It was just 100% ABA. Various points, there were videos, and quite a few of them were of young autistic people being forced to keep their hands on their knees. And they would be punished. And I'm not talking about aversives, having something withdrawn, but nevertheless punished if they didn't keep their hands on their knees. You know, so what's this about? Well, it's clearly about avoidance of stimming. Now, everybody stims, I think. Everybody engages in repetitive behaviours. It's not just autistic people who do, everybody does. And I want to give you an example here. It dates back about 12 years, I think. It was before my wife and I left the country. We've only just come back in the last couple of years. And I was driving in Leicester and I was approaching a roundabout and there was a car in front of me and the person had their right hand clamped to their mouth. Now, I'm quite observant because I'm a trained observer. I'm quite observant. And I'd noticed in the sort of 2 or 3 years up to this incident that a lot of people would actually hold their right hand, or if they were left-handed, their left hand on their mouth. And that's a sort of rather odd behaviour, and it actually petered out. I've not seen it since I came back to the UK. But on this occasion, this person had their right hand clamped to them to the upper lip, and they were struggling to drive round the roundabout one-handed. Now, if anybody's tried to, I hope you haven't, but if anybody has tried to drive around a roundabout one-handed, it's next to impossible. They were really struggling. Now, that is an example of what I would call repetitive behaviour. It was one that started up and then disappeared. Repetitive behaviour. Was the person driving the car in front of me autistic? I very much doubt it. Everybody engages in repetitive behaviour. Everybody stims in a way. What I think a lot of people dislike is the particular types of stimming that autistic people can do. And you know, I mean, this is I'm getting angry now. So let's move on to the next slide, if I may. This is a slide from the 40-hour training I did. I have a screenshot of the actual slide on my computer. What I'm showing this to you for is simply to show that proponents of ABA, when training ABA practitioners, can be exceedingly derogatory about other interventions. Now, I'm not here to support or to advocate for social stories, but look at that, the ugly, and underneath that, social stories. I find that utterly unacceptable. But everybody being trained by this particular major organization in the US as a registered behavior technician will see this slide and the comments that the presenter made about that. Right, let's move on, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. I want to start moving in the direction. No, one back, please. Previous slide, please. Thank you. I want to start. No, the next one. The one in the middle, the one headed Naturalistic Developmental Behavioural Interventions. Thank you very much. I want to move towards talking about the autism worldview dilemma. There may be other attempts to reconcile the fundamental difference between positionalities such as the radical behaviorism that underpins ABA and neurodiversity. This is the only one that I've been able to find. It's really interesting. It's about, as you can see, naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, NDBIs. It's been authored by a group of autistics and non-autistics, so that's definitely a strength of the paper. It's well written. It's clearly very well researched, and it's an attempt to reconcile neurodiversity and what they describe as contemporary autism interventions. It brings together behaviorism and developmental theory. Now, my view is that you can't reconcile two positionalities that are diametrically opposed, like radical behaviorism, which underpins ABA, and neurodiversity. I just don't think you can do that. They're too far apart. So I describe this as a laudable, well-written, but flawed, ultimately flawed attempt to develop a unifying framework, because it forces neurodiversity and behaviorism together in a very unnatural way. Now, I've delved into this a little bit more deeply, and it's a researcher known as Schreibman and his or her colleagues who developed the idea of naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions. And I read their paper, and they talk about autistic people with established patterns of maladaptive behavior. And if you were to look at this publication, you would also see that they were quite complimentary about Ivor Lovers's report, in which he said that he'd recovered autistics back in the 1970s, and which most people reject. So I just wonder whether this is supposed to be the acceptable face of ABA, but fundamentally, I don't think that you can reconcile two fundamentally different positionalities regarding autism. So that still leaves us with the autism worldview dilemma. So if we move on to the next slide, please. I think that whether or not one adopts a neurodiversity affirmative perspective, and I say that because, you know, not every autistic person believes in the neurodiversity paradigm, and it doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. There is sufficient evidence that the cognition of autistic people differs in certain important ways from that of non-autistic people. And with ABA being founded on the principles of radical behaviorism, which argues that we're all just a set of behaviors, eradicate the behaviors you don't like and the person is no longer autistic. Well, you know, we're in a problematic situation here. Recovery from autism just means eradication of obvious characteristics of autism. There's increasing evidence that ABA-based techniques can be traumatic for autistics. I mentioned Kupferstein. There are a few other reports that have come out saying similar things. And so I ask the question, how can one support autism interventions being delivered by practitioners who appear not to accept that autism involves cognitive and sensory differences when the evidence for this is incontrovertible? Now, if you think that autism is just a set of behaviours which you can eradicate, the person no longer is autistic, okay, so, you know, you've achieved your purpose. No, you haven't achieved your, well, you may think you've achieved your purpose, but actually the person is still autistic, and indeed you may have harmed them by forcing them to normalise. And you know, it's these markedly different worldviews on autism which I think give rise to what I call the autism worldview dilemma. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. And this is just a repeat of the earlier one, showing you some theoretical perspectives on autism. And it interests me. I mean, I tried to put this in an order, as I said, a sort of spectrum from not being a fully moral human being to no such thing as autism. And I kept changing the positions in the spectrum. I came up with this order, which may or may not be right. Well, what really interested me was that natural human difference, autism as natural human difference, neurodiversity with a theoretical basis in monotropism and polytropism is actually right next to the ABA situation, i.e. behaviour which just needs to be normalised, i.e. eradicated. And with a fundamental grounding in radical behaviorism. And I thought it was quite interesting that those two are so close together. They're so close together in this spectrum of perspectives on autism, and yet they're fundamentally different. They are as different as two perspectives can be. And I think that, to me, just emphasizes just how problematic the autism worldview dilemma is. If we could move on, please. And so where do we go from here? 80 years since autism was first named, and in all that time, I mean, that's not far short of a whole century, we still don't have a definitive understanding of what autism is. Now, I imagine most of you would support the neurodiversity paradigm. Maybe not all, but most would. Most would probably be favouring neurodiversity affirmative work and practice. These NDBIs that I've mentioned aren't a solution because they attempt to reconcile diametrically opposed worldviews. And I haven't come across anything else which attempts to reconcile them or which attempts any other solution. So you have to ask yourself the question, I've asked this myself many times, is the autism worldview dilemma insurmountable? And this is where I come on to, some of you may not like the title big autism, but you know where this is coming from, big oil, big pharma. I think that the autism industry, perhaps that's a better way of describing it, in the USA, is probably the biggest challenge that we face. It's embedded in US national and state legislation. It's embedded in their healthcare system because, as I understand it, the healthcare will only pay for ABA. They won't pay for any other interventions for autism. It's a really major employer, and it's highly profitable. So would anybody actually want to accept that maybe what they were doing is not the best thing for most autistic people, or even some autistic people? That's where the challenge lies, I think. Here we are in the UK. Maybe there are some people attending from abroad, but I mean, I'm in the UK, I'm looking at this from a UK perspective and saying to myself, the way the healthcare system over here is going, it seems to be polarizing in a way that that you see in the US. You know, people with plenty of money can afford private healthcare, and the rest of us have to make do with a badly underfunded National Health Service who do what they can with the facilities and staff and all the rest of it that are available to them, but they're facing their own challenges. Is it possible that ABA may become more embedded over here than it currently is? I don't know. It's certainly a risk, I think, and as I used to be a corporate risk manager, it's a risk that I would want to manage if I was taking a look at autism from the perspective of interventions. I think there's nothing original here. There's nothing new. I'm just saying that I think that we're doing the right thing. I think that activists and researchers are doing the right thing. We're tackling the dilemma from two directions, making the case for neurodiversity affirmative practice and challenging radical behaviorism. So, I mean, am I running out of time, Damian? You've appeared there, which rather suggests I am. That's actually the end of my presentation. There are just some references at the end.
We've run over time and into the comfort break, I'm afraid.